So the next presentation this afternoon is from me, so I suppose I should do a short introduction of myself because I didn't do a big one this morning. But just to tell you a little bit about what I do, I live in Cape Town in South Africa. I grew up in Pretoria, which is the capital city, and I work at a startup called 227 in Cape Town, and we work really at the intersection of behavioral economics and personal finance, and trying to understand how we can tackle human behavior in relation to finance. So that's the startup that I'm involved with. I also write for some magazines in South Africa, including Finweek, which is a financial weekly magazine, and I have a radio show on national radio in South Africa, which I suppose you could tune in to on the internet in Sweden. I also, travel around and do these talks, and that's what I'm going to do right now. So if we could get my slides going, that would be cool. Or do I get, there we go, okay. All right, so what I want to talk to you about today is the subject of where I'm from and something that I'm very passionate about, of course, and that is the continent where I was born. And I've given you a picture of Africa as an outline, without any borders internally, because I want to start by posing a question. And that question is, when I say the word Africa, I want you to think of the images that come into your head immediately. So forget what you've heard today, perhaps, and just think about some pictures when I say the word Africa. And some of you might have traveled to Africa, or you might have friends who have been there, and you might think of the fantastic images that come across on an African safari, perhaps the sun setting over the savannah, the beautiful wildlife that we have in our different countries in Africa, and that's probably one of the images that comes to mind. You might also think of rural Africa, and how many people still live in a way that really hasn't changed over the last few centuries, even if the environment around those villages has changed quite a lot. Perhaps you think about the remnants of colonization, about townships and informal settlements. You might have visited one or two of these yourself if you've traveled in Africa and experienced how many Africans live, which is with standards that, as Europeans, it's probably quite difficult to comprehend. But if you've been to these areas, you find some qualities that are quite positive. One of the things that you find is, as we've said several times today, the maker movement is very strong in townships across Africa. There's also a very strong sense of community. I think in big cities in the rest of the world, including in Africa, we tend to be quite aloof. We tend to focus on our own little sphere of influence in our own little world, and we've lost that very strong sense of togetherness that you still find when you travel to the more rural and undeveloped parts of Africa. But I want to show you some images that probably don't come to mind. The one is of a high-speed train. This is called the Gau train. And it runs in Johannesburg. It connects the central business district of Sandton in Johannesburg to the airport, and it's starting to spread its rails elsewhere in the country. And when you think of Africa, you probably don't think of high-speed trains, but we have those in South Africa too. We also have winelands. This is near my house in Cape Town. And you could be looking at a picture of Napa Valley, perhaps, or parts of France, where vineyards are quite common. Of course, Cape Town is one of the big wine-producing regions of the world, and this kind of image is also one that's quite common in Cape Town. Now, I've chosen two pictures from my home of South Africa quite specifically, because I think we need to be careful about the terms in which we talk about a continent as vast as Africa. Because, of course, if we do fill in the borders, we're really talking about 57 different countries. We're talking about 1.2 billion people. And we're talking about over 1,000 different languages. In my country alone, which is the tiny tip of this massive continent, we have 11 official languages, not spoken languages, official languages. So there's a lot of complexity in Africa that gets hidden when we talk about the continent as a singular unit. When we talk about Africa, we forget about all of these different people, all of these different cultures, all of these languages that are brought together under that one name of Africa. And if we're going to develop solutions for an area like Africa, we really need to start to understand the hidden complexity under that name. We need to get our teeth into that diversity, into the different cultures, and how different people consider the world in a continent like Africa. So that said, I do want to talk in general terms about one phenomenon and one trend that I'm very excited about in Africa. Because the mobile phone is really something that you can talk about in those terms, right? Last week, the announcement was made by a firm called Informa that there are now more than 750 million mobile phones in Africa, which means that roughly 3/4 of the population of Africa now have mobile phones. They can now communicate. They can get things done in their businesses that they couldn't do before. And that is an exciting phenomenon, especially if you listen to Jamison Toole's talk today about big data and the impact that could have on healthcare, on government services, and on developing cities. So when we talk about mobile phones in Africa, we're able to apply a bit of those general terms and look at some of the exciting trends that are happening. Now, when I say mobile phone to people in Europe, I think a lot of you will think about something like this, right? So this is my personal Galaxy Nexus, and since 2007 and the rise of the smartphone, which started with the iPhone, if you think about it, this really is what a lot of people in the developed world think of when we talk about mobile phones. This, however, is not what the norm is in Africa when we talk about mobile phones, right? So I have a friend, his name is Toby Shapshak, he's the editor of Stuff magazine in South Africa, which of course is the world's biggest gadget magazine, and he often gets asked about his favorite mobile phone. And he says, well, if you're in Africa, it's something like this, okay? So this is something I bought at a clothing store in Cape Town. These phones cost between $8 and $12, and according to Informa, by 2015, this kind of phone will still outnumber the smartphone by 6-1. So when we talk about mobile phones in Africa, this is really what we're talking about. But in Africa, this is more than just a smartphone, right? This is a bit of a superphone. And I'll tell you why. This device over here does a few things that the iPhone absolutely cannot do, and some things that the iPhone is very bad at. So you're probably wondering what those features are. Well, for one, there's the price, right? You're not going to get a smartphone for between $8 and $12. I paid about $11 for this one. So that's something that you won't find a smartphone doing. The battery will last at least a week on a single charge. That's a very important feature if you live in Africa, in a village that doesn't have power. And it's something that I think anybody with a smartphone knows is absolutely impossible with Android or the iPhone. Okay, you're lucky if you get to lunchtime on a smartphone. So that's an important feature. It has an FM radio. And FM radio is still the most pervasive medium in Africa. If you aren't on radio in Africa, you may as well not be there. It also has a torch, which you activate with a button over there, which is again very handy if you live in a rural area where there's no power. And so this kind of phone, for very obvious reasons, continues to dominate the African market. Of course, the challenge is that you can't easily get data services to a device like this. All right? 3G and 4G, not so much. All right, so it's great for talking to people and sending SMSs, but it also has the ability to do something else that can be used to transfer information, and that's utilizing a service called USSD. So some of you will be familiar with USSD. It's still used in parts of the developed world for banking mostly, and it basically allows you to transfer information over 2G networks using text. Okay, so traditionally you'll enter a hashtag into your mobile phone, like *123#, and you'll access a menu, and you can start to get information that way. Now that's very rudimentary compared to what you can do with a 3G or an LTE connection, right? But it's amazing what can be done with something as simple as USSD, when you think about it in a very needs-based way. And that really underscores all of the innovation that we're seeing in Africa. It flows from necessity. So I'll give you an example of USSD services being used for something awesome, right? Farmers in Africa are now able to use their mobile phones to access vital information like what the weather is, the current prices for fertilizer, where the nearest place is to get water, and they can increasingly start to trade with each other using USSD networks as well. So for virtually free, they're able to now transfer information vital to their businesses, access these services, and it's changing lives. And that's quite important, and we've seen this kind of service rolled out in rural India and other parts of the developing world as well. Needs-based innovation. So while people in Europe and the USA are checking in on Foursquare, farmers in Africa are checking out the latest prices of fertilizer, and I think that's pretty cool. But, you know, big companies in the rest of the world are starting to realize that they could latch onto USSD too. So this is an example of a service that allows you to access Facebook over USSD. And while this is quite clearly the screen of an iPhone, you can access this information using something as simple as this African superphone over here. All right, so Facebook is latching onto this. Wikipedia is becoming available via USSD on some services. And so without 3G and without LTE, people are making very meaningful use of information on mobile phones. So I've got this, I'm excited about that because it's fairly simple, and I've got this sort of diagram that I use whenever we talk about this particular phenomenon with my design teams at 22/7, just to explain sort of the intuitiveness of systems. And quite simply, the triangle is the amount of complexity of a system, and of course all products are systems in themselves, and the line is how intuitive the system is, and everything above the line is what the consumer or the end user customer has to deal with in terms of that complexity. And everything below the line is what you, as the manufacturer or developer, need to deal with in terms of that complexity, right? So it's fairly obvious. The more intuitive a system becomes, the less of that complexity is obvious to the end user, and the more of the complexity you have to deal with as the manufacturer or the developer of that particular system. Now, unfortunately, in Africa, until now, the diagram has looked like that. A lot of companies have looked at Africa and they've gone, hey, there's a great business opportunity here. Let's get the cheapest, quickest product into the market as possible. They deal with very little of the complexity, and they leave the end user dealing with a massive amount of complexity in that system. And that's bad on one hand, but it's very good on the other hand, because it forces Africans to take these products and shape them for themselves. All right? And we heard about Sugru today and the fantastic things that you can do with the product in your environment. I'm very excited when I think about something like Sugru getting into rural Africa because of this phenomenon. So when we talk about the maker movement in Africa, it's not necessarily something that they're doing because it's frivolous and fun. It's something that they're doing because they have to. Now, there's some fantastic initiatives that have started to spring up around technologies like USSD. But also that don't necessarily directly involve technology. And I just want to talk about one or two of those. This is a project called Kubeka that I'm particularly excited about. It's one of the coolest ideas I've ever heard, right? And so this is quite obviously a tree sapling, and it's something that we need more of in Africa. You probably didn't think we needed more trees in Africa, but we do. There are vast areas of Africa that need to be reforested, and we need a lot of tree saplings. There's another thing that we have too much of in Africa, and that's garbage. And trust me, we have a hell of a lot of garbage in Africa, right? So the question is, how do you get more of these and less of those, of that, right? And that's what Kubeka really does, because what it does is it takes tree saplings and garbage and it turns it into bicycles. So this isn't just any bicycle. It's called a buffalo. It was specifically developed for use in rural Africa. And bicycles are the perfect forms of transport in a township or a village. They don't have tarred roads. You need a certain degree of literacy and education to get a driver's license. Cars in themselves are very expensive and dirty to operate. A bicycle, on the other hand, is very simple. It's pretty indestructible. It doesn't require any fossil fuels. It doesn't need a proper road. And if you're in a township, this is exactly the kind of transportation that you need to get around every day. So what Kubeka said is, okay, we've got the special bicycle that was developed for use in Africa, and we're going to ship these into Africa in crates, like big shipping crates. And then we're going to turn the big shipping crate into a shop where you can get your bicycle repaired. So that's pretty cool, right? You've got bicycles in the village, and one person in the village is going to become a business owner, taking ownership of the shipping crate, and then servicing these bicycles. But what they then did was they made a deal with the people in these areas. And they said, we'll show you how to plant tree saplings, and we'll give you seeds. And for every 100 tree saplings that you bring us, we'll give you a bicycle. Okay? And then we'll take these trees, we'll sell them to the various companies that need trees, but more importantly, we'll use them in reforestation efforts. But if you bring us a ton of garbage as well, we'll give you a bicycle in exchange for that. So go and find all of the recyclable garbage that you can, bring that to us, and we'll give you a bicycle every time you bring us a ton. So you can get a bicycle for yourself, or you can start getting lots of bicycles and you can become a reseller of bicycles. We can also launch some amazing recycling projects around all of this garbage that we're getting and create some jobs from that and get some money going into the system from recycling. And so Quebeca is a fantastic example of the kind of innovation that's coming out of Africa and the kind of innovation that we need. All right? It's highly collaborative, it tackles several problems at once, and it's bred from necessity. The maker movement in Africa, as I said, is picking up momentum. Maker Fair Africa gets more and more people every time it happens. It recently happened in Nigeria, and we saw some fantastic inventions at Maker Fair. So I encourage you, if you can ever get to a Maker Fair in Africa, you'll really see innovation on an amazing scale, and once again, based on necessity. So here we've got a guy, for example, who's figured out a mount for his superphone on his bicycle so that while he cycles the bicycle, it charges his phone. And we're really seeing some cool things come from the Maker Fair and the sort of organization of the whole maker movement. Another fantastic invention I wanted to touch on from the continent is this company called Saffron Energy, which runs out of Tunisia. And what they've done is they've revolutionized wind energy. So they've looked at traditional wind turbines, which is the way we thought we could do wind energy best. And there's some limits around the physics of wind turbines. There's some problems with the noise they make, the vibrations they cause. It's very difficult to store the power from wind turbines. What Saffron Energy's done is they've looked at the model of a sailboat. And they've designed this thing, it's called the Siphonian, and like a sailboat sail, it moves forward and back in the wind, and it creates power 2.3 times more efficiently than traditional wind turbines. This power can also be stored more efficiently. The Siphonian in itself is becoming increasingly cost-effective, and it's starting to pick up a lot of attention around the world. And so we're starting to see innovations come from Africa and flow into the rest of the world, which is not something that we're necessarily used to. I love this quote about innovation from Aniswini, who's the developer of the Siphonian, or the inventor of it, who said, "Innovation isn't just a question of cleverness, it is rather a deeper and different observation of the obvious." Another favorite saying of mine is an old Zulu proverb that says, "If you want to go quickly, go alone. If you want to go far, go together." And that really encapsulates the way that we think about innovation in Africa. And so I want to wrap up today with a challenging thought. And it's something that we've highlighted today a couple of times and was suggested in the questions for the panel at the end of the day, which is why I was so excited about it. And that is, let's think about our approach to the developing world. Traditionally, we've thought of the developing world as a place that needs help from the first world. We've thought that there's lots of things that the third world should learn from the first, and that the flow of information is a one-directional stream from the first world into the third. But if we take time to look at the conditions on the ground, if we put in the borders rather, and we consider the nuances and the complexity and the difference across these markets, and we really get our head around the innovation that's happening in these areas, I think you might find that there's a hell of a lot that the first world could learn from the third. And that's the thought I want to leave you with today at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.